Buen regreso al almuerzo a todos. Espero que tengan...
It's a great opportunity to discuss and to speak about some data about potential yield in corn. Any technology that we want to introduce in productive units, we need to be good planifiers. So we need to know what are the ceilings, what are the possibilities that we have for a technology to be effective. And we need the framework to do this. There are many ways to do this. We are going to consider 3 different ways to quantify this. Juan Pablo will work from a more global point of view. Ariel will share with us his experience he has had in potential corn yield, and Andrés will share with us his experience in the chacras and the potential yields that they are observing currently now. So I will give the floor to Juan Pablo so he can start. And then we can have Q&A session.
Bueno, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes a todos.
I will start talking about yield gaps for corn in Argentina. One of the challenges of agriculture is seen in this graph, in this chart. In the black bars, you will see what increase is expected by 2050 in grain production. We do not only have to increase production, but we have to do it in a sustainable manner so we preserve environment. In Argentina, I will present findings for corn, and then we are going to present general findings for these 3 main crops in Argentina. In the past 5 years, soybean, corn, and wheat show mean yields. You can see it for each of them, the amount of kilos per hectare. We are going to focus on how much we can increase the current yield in corn, how far we can increase using the management practices available right now. We are not talking about introducing an innovation or introducing strange events, but rather considering doing correctly things that we are already doing. If we add these 3 crops, the average for the past 3 years is almost 22 million tons. Most of that production what are the different ways that we have to increase future supply of food? We have 3 options. First, to increase the planted area. This is what has been done so far or in the past century, but there is very little land left to increase planted area. So we might increase only by 9% the planted area. Another way is intensifying the use of land. What does this mean? This is doing more or planting more crops per time unit to have double crops, and this can be increased only by 16%. We are talking about the world numbers, global numbers. And what is the way that could best help us to increase yield is increasing yield by surface unit. More than 65% of this increase will come in this way. All these are the things that we can do, or we increase the yield potential, we improve our genetics, or we close the yield gaps. What does yield gap mean? When you looked at a yield curve vis-a-vis investment, we have a maximum yield, and the difference between that real yield and the potential yield is what we call the yield gap. Here we have the potential yield is what is depends on the cultivar, the yield, the composition, and the potential that that yield can have. Then we have the water-limited yield. How much yield we will be able to achieve based on the water available. And finally, we have the farmer yield, the real yield obtained by the farmer. The difference between these three yields is what we call yield gap. How far can we reduce, or how much can we reduce that gap yield? About 20%. So reduce it beyond the 20% is not profitable, because we have to take into account the price ratio, import application, the risk, which is feared by several farmers, so we are not able to reduce it by 100%. So we will see how much we will be able to reduce that gap by 20%, how far. We have conducted a global study, World Atlas of yield gap is being compiled right now. So what we are studying is trying to analyze how this yield gap can be closed in different countries of the world. This work, or this research work, consists in if we go from left to right, we have a region that is divided in homogeneous agroclimatic areas. In each of these regions, we establish a weather station that works as a reference, that has different data, different pieces of information, and with a simulation model, we estimate what is the possible yield that can be achieved by each of these locations. And then we make an aggregation into the future. For Argentina, we establish all the agroclimatic areas that had a similar behavior. We try to determine which were the main weather stations in each of these areas. And we establish a buffer zone around each weather station where we decided on the crop management. So with the simulation model, we were able to estimate what was the potential yield that could be reached in each of these locations. Something very important. Here we can see the corn crop potential yield depending on the planting date. This gives us very good data of potential yield. And so this allows us to calibrate this potential yield. So the gap is the difference between the potential yield, this is in a dryland system, minus the real yield. The real yield comes from the yield obtained by the farmers, and this data is provided by the Ministry of Agro-Industry. Then we integrated the data in each climatic zone, and then we transfer that at the country level. In the agroclimatical areas that we determined are established in this map, and we also determined what was the dryland potential yield in each of these locations. So the real yield is higher than the potential yield in the dryland. In circles, we can see the value, the yield value. The green part is the real yield obtained right now, and the whiter part or the gray part is the gap yield, the yield gap for each of these areas. In general terms, the yield gap is shorter in the core area in the country where we have more technology, is higher than what than if we compared with the areas outside the Pampas. So we use all this regional data and we transfer it to the country level. Here we have the current yield in the past year has been 6.6 tons. What is the water limited yield is 11.7 tons. This is what we would be able to achieve using inputs in a reasonable manner. The difference between these two is the yield gap. So here we have 24% more leeway to increase the yield gap. If we integrate this into the country level, this meant that from 28.8 million tons to 41.1 tons. So this would increase the income for the country by $2 billion. In soybean, the gap is smaller. In the case of wheat, it is similar to corn yield gap. Using correctly the management practices available right now, we could be passing from 22 million tons to 116 million tons, 16.8 million tons. What is the next step? Here we made a quantification at the country level in order to determine what is the possible yield for each of these crops. And the second phase is what is behind this? What are the causes for these gaps? We are working together with a grain board in Buenos Aires. They evaluated the technology application in different areas. So we are combining their data with our own data, and we found that this yield gap is related to the application of technology. So we are reconfirming what we have seen. And now we will clearly see which are the technologies in each of the regions that could help us reduce this gap. So to close, for corn in Argentina, if we use the available technologies, we could switch from 6.6 tons to 9.4 tons. The use of technologies and the use of fertilizers would be the variables that would allow us to reduce this gap. We need to try to produce more, but in a sustainable manner. Thank you very much. My colleague will continue with his presentation. Going back to what Juan Pablo was just saying, for more than 11 growing years, we were able to determine in the field what is the potential yield that can be achieved with corn if we don't have any type of limitations from the nutritional and water point of view. This was the trial in the 2014-2015 growing year. We introduced late corn with planting date in December. In this photograph to the left, we have the early planting, and to the right, the late planting for corn. We also consider the irrigation systems versus the dryland system. The idea is to try to avoid inefficiency, deficiency, especially phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc. And we try to provide the necessary nitrogen not to limit, in order to avoid limitation of productivity. We follow what the theoretical model of sun radiation gives us. This is this year trial. Here we have a photograph of the early and late corn for this growing year. As you know, we had very little need to irrigate. What happened along these 11 growing years? After 11 trials, we were able to measure that the potential yield for corn is 18.7 tons per hectare. In this chart, we see the fluctuations in different growing years in the blue line, and the light blue line, that would be the mean value, and the red line shows the average yield for Rio Cuarto district. We are talking about 18,655 kilos against 5,995. So this means a yield almost of 13 tons of grain per hectare. What happens with these yields? And the question is whether we achieved agronomically to limit these yields only by temperature and sun radiation or sunlight. These are the corns, the crops that were harvested. Here we have 120,000 corn tassels. Here we see a clear trend to have the limitation on the part of sunlight. Limitation came from sunlight. This is the sunlight received in December and January, which is the critical period for corn. What happens with late corn? Luckily enough, we have 4 growing years where we have been able to measure potential yield of late corn, which is about 15.1 tons per hectare. Here we see 4 growing years where yields were shown, and that variability that we can see in this chart is due to the fact that is due to the sunlight in February, which would be limiting the corn productivity with sufficient water supply. 15.1 tons of grain is a good production for corn in this area. What happened with the yield, potential yield gap associated to the planting date? Here we have 4 growing years. In 3 of them, we had a higher potential yield of early corn versus late corn. The gap of potential yield associated to planting date is 36 hectares. This tells us that it is not true that it is convenient to plant late corn always. I think that we have to plant it when there is lack of water, but when we have enough water, we stop producing corn because we advance the planting date, or we plant earlier. This is the response to irrigation in the 14-15 period. In early planting, the response to risk was 62 hundredweights, and in the late planting, the response reduced or dropped down dramatically. However, it was higher, the response to irrigation in early planting. This shows us that real and potential yield is being limited by the water supply. During these 11 periods, if we compared our trial to what farmers have obtained, we are talking about 160 growers, we see that growers are not applying enough nitrogen. They are applying less phosphorus, less sulfur. They are not applying nutrients such as zinc. But the difference is that they are not fertilizing when nitrogen as they should. On the other hand, we observe in other set of experiments that there is an interaction between seeding rate and nitrogen supply. If you don't fertilize or the dose or the rate is low, this will be important, or this will have an influence as the water supply increases. We have found clearly this interaction. This interaction is being explained because as we increase seeding rate to higher viral, the rooting pattern of corn changes and roots are deeper, and so we improve the nitrogen capture effectiveness. And so here we see the interaction. If we have a seeding rate and interaction, the issue is what is the seeding rate that we are going to use. This model of surface response or response surface tells us that the optimum connervation is when you arrange or when you combine the amount of nitrogen with the number of plants. The optimal productivity would be with a specific combination of nitrogen and number of plants. So if we try to optimize, you can see that 5 experiments give different economic optimal quantities of this ratio between nitrogen and number of plants. In an extreme case with 300 units of nitrogen, 160,000 plants, we achieve 177 hundredweights of corn. And in late plants or inlets, with a late plantation or planting, the ratio is different. So we cannot speak any longer about nitrogen models from the regional point of view. Otherwise, we would need to start to talk about the plant density. What happens with the stand or the planting rate? If we increase to 120 plants per hectare, probably we will have a marked difference. So we should consider put the furrows closer. We are considering elements of 5 growing years where we found differences that favor the having the furrows closer to each other. I have an experience of the San Luis Aapresid regional, which is just the opposite. As we lack more water, we have to reduce the number of plants, and we have to broaden the distance between furrows or rows. The agronomical issues behind this is that we wouldn't be using too much water in the vegetative period, and we would using this water in the productive period. The mean values tells us that the distance between rows at 35 centimeters gave us 1,900 kilos of corn, whereas with 52 centimeters, the production of corn was 17,000 plus. In the past growing year, we analyzed the impact of changing the crop structure in association with the planting date. This chart shows us that in early planting, there is a resource. It is the closing or the getting rows closer is justified, but in late plants we see that there's no impact, there's no improvement if we put rows closer, as it happens with the early planting.
Similar results were found this year in Ingeniero Berri, in the southern part of Rio Cuarto, where we planted 120,000 plants, 1.4 thousand kilograms, or last growing year. Ignacio Fiori, in the area of Chacabuco, made some experiences, and they found an improvement of 866 kilograms per hectare. Last, another important factor that impacts on the potential yield of corn when you plant high density of plant is the planting speed and the standard deviation of the distance between rows. You can clearly see on these photographs that as we increase the speed of planting, we increase density, and we have found values higher to those found in the literature, especially by Purdue University. The standard deviation of the distance between plants, if higher than 8 centimeters, shows big differences in results. This is again Engineer Berry. These are precision planters that can adapt planting differently. This allowed us to increase planting speed without seeing any losses due to a bad distribution of seeds. This is a complex consistency. This is lack of consistency, lack of uniformity, but a seasonal one, especially when we go into high yield environments. The higher the productivity, the higher or the larger the impact on the yield due to this temporary lack of uniformity. And here you have the different numbers that explain that. In summary, based on the research we have completed on potential and normal yield in dryland environment, we see that the environment is having a big impact on the gap. And we have a lot to do in terms of crop of seedling rate, also in terms of fertilization and protection. Of course, most of these tests was done in the University of Rio Cuarto because the engineers who work with us do a lot of tests. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon. We have the Chakras program, which is an integrated program to develop agricultural technologies in specific environments, and we would like to explain the different yield gaps in the environments we are working with, estimated with a different method. It takes data from production fields, and I'd like to explain the farmer's perspective on their main demands to reduce this gap. In Emiliano Posse, the gaps are about 13,200 kilograms. Variation between years, production is about 10,600 kilograms. Farmers set a goal to adjust or to adopt a production model that will face the problem of water excess. And so they are intensifying rotations, they are including a lot of corn, and with corn they are working on nitrogen fertilization. We have seen that by intensifying rotation up to 2 crops a year, we are improving the consumption of rotation, and we can bring consumption closer to water excess, and we are improving the balance. On the other hand, nutrition and density are two variables that should be managed together. They are a tool that can potentiate corn yields in the area. You can see this in the blue bar. This will also lead to a more efficient use of water. Chacra Bandera, these are the yields in dry land, 10,500 kilograms. Currently, our yield is 6,200. The main problem is how to manage weeds, because farmers consider this is the most negative impact on yield. So farmers consider that the most efficient weed management is resorting to an integrated management plan. So they have requested knowledge, understand how weeds work or perform in this area, and start to understand the emerging capacities of the different chemical products to manage these weeds, and they are finding significant results also in reducing the costs of chemical applications. Chacra Valle, no Patagónico, yields here are 100% under irrigation. This is in the province of Rio Negro, in Patagonia. We are reaching 15,200 kilograms. Average yields are about 7,800 kilograms. Farmers' main concern is building the environments and water efficiency, because water is a restriction there. In this area, radiation, sunlight, and temperatures are okay, but water is available in quantity and quality from the Negro River, but we have alluvial use problems. This area is being developed. I mean, the crops in this area are being developed, so farmers are only starting with many crops, and they are demanding knowledge in terms of planting dates, planting requirements. So the potential here is high, even higher to what we are getting. We have to adjust our cropping systems. We have to build environments, build the soil so that all crops, including corn, can express their potential. In Chacra San Luis, yields under dry land are about 9,100, but it varies from one area to the next because we have some weather impact here. Averages are about 5,700 kilograms. This is a semi-arid area, so farmers are concerned about preserving water. They also face erosion, and that affects crops, of course. So we are intensifying rotations, trying to produce cover crops to preserve water resources, to lead to water efficiency, and adjusting nitrogen nutrition. So far, we see that cover crops in San Luis are possible, and with better water efficiencies, but we have to check properly how to manage these cover crops so that that will not lead to negative impacts. As to nitrogen, the nitrogen nutrition are above the average management of farmers. In Chacra Pergamino, average yields between growing years are about 13,000 kilograms, and in certain areas, average is 9,100. The main concern here is that soils are becoming poorer and poorer. So we are trying to intensify rotations to increase carbon sequestration, and we are trying to intensify fertilization to fix better thresholds. Intensification of rotation and introducing corn in the rotation, as well as introducing cover crops, improves carbon contributions. Carbon levels are better now. When we include pastures, we get positive carbon balances. As to nutrition, we see that it's not the same thing to fertilize a corn based on the previous crop. A cover crop, as I said before, is a tool that allows us to potentiate corn yields and reduces the need for fertilization. In Bravo Chivilcoy, yields are about 12,400 kilograms, averages are about 8,600. Farmers have decided to open this chakra program because the yields in corn and in other crops were below their expectations. They thought they could have higher yields. So we are collecting information from the farmers, from the fields, from the plots, first to quantify the production gap in the different areas within the chakra, and trying to define the reasons, and we are implementing field tests to reduce the gap and production variability. So far, we see that in corn, we are getting 15 to 30% improvement, and to reduce the gaps, the different rotation patterns play a very significant role. In the chakra program, we also have another test in the corn core area, because farmers in this area have introduced late corns. We started working on genetics by comparing yields. Then the network expanded, and now we work on health, on nitrogen, and density. In order to start finishing my presentation, we see that in all areas we have production gaps in corn. They are about 20 to 50%. We can improve current yields by 20 to 50%, and when we try to reduce these production gaps, it is crucial to really know the environment, the production system, and include the farmer in the development process, because the empirical knowledge farmers have help us identify the problems that may result in the production gaps, and that of course leads to shorter times to get a proper result. So let me finish by thanking you, the team.
Bueno, manejo del tiempo excelente, lo disertante. Tuvimos un tiempo ahí hablando. Ahora hay tiempo para las preguntas.
Now it's time for a Q&A session. For Juan Pablo, which are the main factors that explain the corn production gaps? We work a lot on defining the gap in Argentina, and the next step is to assess the different technologies. I think Gabriel and the other presentation contributed many explanations. Our number one practice is the low nutrition level. The extraction is higher than the replenishment. I'm talking about nutrients. That is the main cause we are assessing. But we still have to continue completing tests. Gabriel, which are the total water consumptions and the contribution of irrigation to get those 18 tons? Water consumptions are ranging from 700 to 900 millimeters. When you plant 120,000 plants of corn, that's a Formula 1. And the contribution of irrigation was from 60 millimeters in the most humid year to 480 millimeters in 2005-2006. Many times I was asked whether this was economically profitable, and the result has always been positive. So besides the experimental aspect, I think there's a good economic equation here. We have an experience in Balcarce for potential yield. We see that with years, the crop does not consume more water, but consumes water more efficiently. Gabriel, what do you think about the response of corn crop before humic and fulvic acids, amino acid, and nutrient mobilizing microorganisms? Good question. This year and last year, we completed the first experiments with certain commercial products. It was quite attractive what we saw. We are still assessing the results, but what we saw is that the nitrogen response was the classic response. And when we started adding these foliar fertilizers, the end response changes. It seems that yield increases, but it doesn't reach high fertilization. But I have only 2 tests in 1 year. I would like to say, concerning the previous question, that we had this water efficiency graph. You saw the potential and the real use. When you go to better water efficiency, you can see a very important increase. Andrés, in the different chakra programs, how do you measure the yields that you achieve? It's different, the methodology we use. We work with databases, we assess the yields per growing year, and we take the percentiles. And based on that, the reachable yield, it's a database from 10 growing years, and the bars are the deviations in the 95% percentile. Andrés, which is the crop that allows you to create soils in the valley? Well, that depends upon the production system each company is using. Some companies are including perennial grasses or covers, and there are other companies very much focused on agriculture, and they are introducing corn and sorghum that bring a lot of carbon, some cover crops such as barley, and they are testing different interplanting with things like moa, or leave the cover crop. so that they start growing before corn. So create some biological activity during the longest time possible. Thank you, Andrés. I have a question for Juan Pablo. My question is, the main gaps were where? In the good years and in the bad years? Well, those gaps, the yield gaps, are higher in the larger yield potential years. That shows that the technology applied by farmers is relatively low compared to the reachable yield. Some years you have less water, so the technology we're using in terms of density, nitrogen management is enough for those years. But in those years where we really have potential, we are not using enough technology.
For me, it's the other way around, which is good because that's science. For me, the maximum potential yields are attained when there's an intense sun radiation associated to years when there are no clouds, which means it's a relatively dry year. In that year is when growers get the minimum quantity. Therefore, the gap, as seen from that point of view, is maximum in the bad years and smaller in the good years. Besides this, I agree with Juan Pablo. The serious problem that we have is a low technological adoption. We don't take advantage of everything we have at hand. It's an interesting concept. I would tend to think the other way around at the beginning. Gabriel, if you measure and based on density, which is the role of the genotype, it's very important. This year we used the same genotype, but we have done some tests in previous years, about 2004, when the intensity was significant based on the genotype. Therefore, if we add another factor apart from the genotype, there could be a triple interaction for any of us when we want to calculate how many kilograms of nitrogen we have to add to corn. The answer is it depends on density and on the genotype, and it also depends on the year. Therefore, the answer is a very complex one. I have another question for Andrés. You talked about some plots with potential yields. Within that data set, there are soils which are problematic with genetic problems. How do you think we should address the work to decrease the gap? Or is there a potential that can be attained by means of the management you are taking, considering in Rio Negro, for example, we find the most limitant for production on soil. There is still room for improvement for the potential yield per plot, because we are seeing higher yields than those I have presented here today. There is a lot in terms of how the environment can produce if we rotate the crops. Any question? You can raise your hand. Or if the speakers want to add anything, please do. I think we could see the topic from different viewpoints. The gap and the potential yields. There are different tools and ways to do it. There is room for introducing technology to shorten the gaps, but the analysis that each of us perform in each production unit is important, and introducing these concepts and considering the gap is important to take these concepts into account, to see figures if it is difficult to attain the 100% potential, we are getting to a 20%, which is a very difficult one. Management practices that we have to fine-tune as we get to the production potential, and we should take all these messages home to apply to our production units, fields, or plots. I would like to add something. Based on Andrés' answer, both CREA and Aapresid are working with season-based analysis. It's a valuable technique, but it should be more interesting if we sectorized it based on the type of soil. That would clean the data. And as we have just said, technology as applied by farmers seem to be limiting the reachable yield. This is an important factor, especially for problematic soils, not those chemically degraded. No more questions. Thank you very much.